Greetings, everyone. Welcome. We are glad that you are joining us today for the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition's 2020 webinar series, Truth in History, Examining Indian Boarding Schools in California specifically. This is part one of our three-part webinar series, Understanding and Addressing the Legacy of Indian Boarding Schools through Examining the Records. And just a couple of items about our platform today. You'll notice that if you're on a desktop, I'm not sure how it works on mobile devices, but if you're on a desktop, you have a little control panel, should be popping up on the right side of your screen. That allows you to do a couple of things. You can configure your view. Right now, you should be seeing all three of our presenters plus the screen that we're sharing, and you can make any or all smaller or larger. Sorry about that technical glitch. So you can make each view according to what you would like. And we're going to issue a quick poll to see who's joining us today. So our first question is, are you a boarding school survivor, or are you a boarding school survivor descendant, or neither? So if you could answer that question, we're going to pop up there. Okay, it says, okay, looks like that poll is being responded to. Oopsie.
I have about 93% that have voted, so we're going to go ahead and give you 5 more seconds to select and close it so we can show you the results.
Yeah, that was weird. It made all my stuff go glitchy there. So we're going to have another poll. And this one is, what sector are you listening in from? And that has the options to select, are you listening from tribal services or urban Indian services? Are you joining us? Are you a social worker, are you with child welfare? Are you a counselor or in healing? That's another second option. Third option would be education, academia, higher ed, or pre-K through 12. Or are you with library, archival, museum, or information sciences? And then, of course, other. We always have other because we only get 5 response options. So let us know. And again, we're really glad to have you with us today. Oops. Sam, you want to let me know when we close that? I think
Sure.
It's changing the way I can see things here. So, and then can you read us the results?
Yeah, so almost all of you have submitted. We have, with the most being other, of course, that's a challenge, but 32% being the largest category, with education, academia, higher ed, PK-12, right behind it, 20% library, archival, information scientists, 10% with social work, child welfare, counseling and healing, and 5% tribal services, urban Indian services.
Great. How about boarding school survivors and descendants?
We had 30% boarding school descendants, 2% boarding school survivors, and 69% neither.
Okay. All right. So on that control panel that you participated in the poll with, you will also notice there is a place where you can ask us questions. So feel free to type in your questions as we go through our presentation. We'll have about 20 minutes at the end to answer your questions and dialogue with you all. And or you can wait until the end to ask your questions, as we may answer them throughout the presentation. But that is where you can go ahead and enter in your questions. Also, if you answered other, why don't you just go ahead and use that question field to tell us which sector you are joining us from. We would really like to know that information. Thank you. Okay, so let's move on to introductions. So I'll let each of our directors who are on the webinar introduce themselves. We also have a director who you don't see here presenting, but he is with us, and that is Vance Blackfox, who is our Director of Communications. He's live tweeting. So if you are tuning in and you are somebody who's on Twitter, go ahead and follow us and tag us in your tweets. Also, I think Instagram and Facebook, he might put some posts over there on those platforms as well. But my name is Christine Dindisi McCleve, Dinawe Magani Duke, Dindisi Indigenous Kaz, Makinak Waju and Dunjiba, Mikizi and Dudame. And I am from Turtle Mountain. I am Anishinaabe, and I am Eagle Clan. My Ojibwe name, Dindisi, means Blue Jay. I'm also the CEO for the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. We are headquartered in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and we're all working from home, as you can see. I do this work for both personal and professional reasons. I did my master's thesis on Native American spirituality and Christianity, but I chose that topic because my grandfather and my great-grandfather went to boarding schools, and I've experienced the intergenerational effects, impacts, and trauma that come along with those experiences in my family. So that is why I do this work, and I am really excited to share with you all today what the coalition has been up to. I will now let our Director of Research and Programs introduce himself.
Nilse Kualitonali Shimo Seritzi no Nanotoka Samuel Torres, Mexica, Neni Kuala Los Angeles, El Paso, Texas, Zacatecas, Mexico. Tasokamati Walmiak. I just shared with you that I'm glad that you're joining us today. Thank you and welcome. My name is Samuel Torres. I'm Mexica. I was born in the lands now known as Los Angeles, but my family comes from El Paso, Texas, and Zacatecas, Mexico. I have recently moved to the Twin Cities in Minnesota to work and be with NABS and all of the incredible people as the Director of Research and Programs here. I recently moved from Los Angeles, so I am learning all of the great things, the incredible things about this place, and extremely honored and really humbled by this great work and the ability to be able to pursue the ambitious goals and the mission of NABS. I also recently earned my educational doctorate in leadership for social justice from Loyola Marymount University last year, where I constructed a decolonizing framework for Indigenous education, and under the guidance and the advice of my dear mentor and dissertation chair, Dr. Antonia Darder. So I'm very grateful to be able to share this space with you, remote as it is, and so thank you for being with us today.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Torres. Hello, Stephen Curley and Shia, Kinklachitni Nishle, Ozeoshihan Bashashtin, Ashkan Hozatni Dashache, Tachnizatni Dashanale, Akot Ego Dene Nishle. I'm Stephen Curley. I'm the Director of Digital Archives here at the NABS, and I've been acting in that capacity since last fall of 2019. So I myself, along with Dr. Torres, I'm an import to the Midwest from the Southwest. So I'm originally from the Tucson, Arizona area. So one of the things that I miss being away from home is the monsoon season. So that's currently going on right now. So the petrichor is resplendent over there. So I'll be talking a little bit more about the Digital Archives program with NABS. So I'll get around to that later on in the presentation. So thank you very much for taking the time to be with us today.
Awesome. I'm so grateful to have the current staff at the coalition. As some of you know who've been members and following us for a number of years, we were established in 2012 as a nonprofit, and we hired our first employee in 2015. That was me. I worked by myself for a number of years. And so to have this amazing, outstanding team of experts and wonderful, talented people now working towards boarding school healing is such a blessing. And we want to make sure to thank our sponsor. The San Manuel Band of Mission Indians is providing funding for this programming, and is the part of the reason that we are focusing in the second and third part of the series on boarding schools in California. So thank you, San Manuel. All right, so our agenda for today is, in a nutshell, I'm going to give you a background on boarding school history. I'm going to talk about the context for why we're looking at records, why we've created a digital archive, how that's related to truth, healing, and transformation, and our mission, obviously. And then Dr. Torres is going to talk about data sovereignty, data decolonization, some of our research methodology that we're developing. And then Stephen Curley is going to segue and introduce to you this big project, this awesome, amazing, wonderful project that we're so excited to share, the National Indian Boarding School Digital Archive. And he's also going to demonstrate, give us all a little demo of the platform. So this is groundbreaking for us, and we're so glad that you're all here with us to be part of this today. So the Boarding School Healing Coalition, for short, because our full name is really long, our vision is to see Indigenous cultural sovereignty restored to the point where we were prior to settler colonial contact, that we have all our rights intact to be our sovereign selves, and that includes our cultural and traditions and language expressions. Our mission is specifically to lead in the pursuit of understanding and addressing the ongoing trauma that was a result of the U.S. Indian boarding school policy. So very succinct there, but there's a lot to unpack in that succinct mission statement. So I'm a big fan of setting the context. I think without historical context, we can't fully understand where we are as a nation, as a society, as human beings, and we also cannot learn from our past, and we cannot plan for our future without that context. So I always begin by talking about the doctrine of discovery and this idea of manifest destiny that launched these lands that we call Turtle Island, which is essentially North America, into the current state that we find ourselves today, which is these countries called Canada, the United States, and Mexico. And this was the doctrine of discovery, for those who don't know, was a papal bull issued by the Roman Catholic Pope, who basically said that people who inhabited or who found lands that were inhabited by non-Christian people could take those lands and claim them for the church, and also for the Spanish crown. And so that is how Columbus got his commission to come here, or to go to India actually, and got lost and came here and was discovered by Indigenous peoples. So this painting depicts this idea of manifest destiny and how it's called, the painting is called American Progress, and this is the angel Columbia, and she is moving from east to west. And you can see in the background there is a town, there's steamboats, there's the railroad is being established, there's stagecoaches. In the forefront there's agriculture, and she's stringing a telephone line, and she's holding a book signifying, you know, education and Western civilization and advancement. And she is moving westward. And as the background gets dark and cloudy and ominous, you can see the buffalo are running away, and in the foreground there are Indigenous people who are also fleeing. So this was the idea of American progress. Here it is, right here. Picture's worth 1,000 words. And all of this, of course, was aimed at the removal of Indigenous peoples, for that westward expansion, for the establishment of the United States of America, and for them to get more lands, for them to claim those lands. And we talk about historical trauma in layers, that the boarding school era and experiences were only one layer of trauma that Indigenous people in this country experienced. The first was obviously contact. With contact came foreign diseases that we had no immunity to. After initial contact and diseases decimating our population, we encountered conflict where there were invaders who tried to remove us from our homelands, all-out wars once the United States established itself through the Declaration of Independence, saying that the merciless Indian savages were still a problem. And then they put us onto reservations, they made treaties, they broke treaties. You know, you get the picture, right? There, these layers of historical, generations of historical trauma, leading up to assimilation, when they tried multiple tactics to try to assimilate us, including boarding schools. They tried to terminate our reservations, thinking that we would just, you know, disperse and integrate into Western society. And now we are currently in the self-determination era, and we are still fighting for our rights to this day. One of our educational resources is a publication called Healing Voices, Volume 1. We're currently working on Volume 2. And in Volume 1, we created this timeline of Indian policy. Of course, it's not every single Indian policy, but it's a lot of the really big, important ones, okay? So some of these you'll see are particularly poignant. Things like the Indian Removal Act. Oh, the Indian Civilization, I was actually looking for it here, but I know this. So I was like, where is it on here though? The Indian Civilization Fund Act is important to understanding boarding schools. And basically here it is. The US set up a fund to civilize the Indigenous people. And then they created the Bureau of Indian Affairs, but that was created under the Department of the Army, because that was the department that dealt with Indian people, because they were the ones warring with us and removing us. And then Grant's peace policy was another piece of legislation that kind of went on top of these other pieces that allowed for those civilization funds to be administered to churches for those acts of civilization, which led the way to federally funded church-run boarding schools. Quick overview of boarding school history is that the first federal off-reservation Indian boarding school was established in 1879. That was the Carlisle Indian boarding school. And we consider that assimilative style boarding schools ran up until the 70s. There are still Indian boarding schools open today, but in the 70s, due to some of that self-determination era legislation, the schools got turned over to the tribes to be run in coordination with the tribes, and now promote culture and language versus prohibit culture and language. But in the beginning, children were removed from their families as young as age 4 or 5. They were sent hundreds of miles away from home so that they wouldn't run away and go home. And they were purposefully removed from their family, from their community, and they were beaten if they spoke their language or if they participated in any of their traditional protocols, ceremonies, prayers, any of that. And it was very brutal. Assimilation process. There was forced conversion. They were not only forced to speak English, but they were forced to attend church services. Even at the federal boarding schools that weren't necessarily a church-run boarding school, they still included Christianity in part of their educational indoctrination of these children. They were treated as military soldiers. A lot, as you can see the photo, they're often dressed in military-style uniforms. They were given a number. They were treated very inhumanely. Corporal punishment was used. They were malnourished. And, obviously these are federal boarding schools. So, we all know how the federal government operates budgets. The children were used for forced labor. A lot of times building the buildings, sewing the uniforms, growing the food, and just emotionally, spiritually, and physically neglected and abused in a lot of cases. Obviously, as the generations went on, boarding school experiences changed somewhat, and you may have heard your parents or grandparents talk about, some positive experiences at boarding school, meeting friends, maybe even meeting their spouse. We do acknowledge that there were some positives that came with boarding school experiences, skills, education, and relationships that were built. But there is also quite a dark legacy that we are focused on addressing because it has led to this intergenerational trauma. So the original motto that was created at the first boarding school at Carlisle by Pratt was "Kill the Indian, save the man." And where did that come from? Well, we have a quote from Pratt that says, "A great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead one, and that high sanction of his destruction has been an enormous factor in promoting Indian massacres. In a sense, I agree with the sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man." So he was viewing himself as a compassionate Christian man, and he wrote a book called The Red Man's Moses. So, take that with a grain of salt. And I'd just like to point out that this whole notion of, transferring children to another group and assimilating them meets the definition of genocide. And some people call it cultural genocide, but cultural genocide actually is genocide, as we can see from the United Nations Geneva Convention, Article 2. All of these things have happened here in the US, that the acts were committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, such as killing members of the group, causing serious bodily harm or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. We know that forced sterilization did happen to women here in the United States, Native American women. And of course, this forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. This is the definition of genocide. And for those who want to argue it further, although I don't think any of you on the webinar would argue with us, there are some books that have been written that call it a Holocaust or genocide. And so we definitely point that out, and we don't apologize for saying this is not just cultural genocide, this is genocide. Unfortunately, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was not enacted or not adopted by the UN until 2009, and we could have used that a couple hundred years ago, but it says that Indigenous peoples have the right not to be subjected to forced assimilation or destruction of our culture. That's one of our inherent rights. We also point out at the coalition that the boarding schools were, that this boarding school policy was the United States' first Indian child welfare policy. So in 1978, the Indian Child Welfare Act was adopted into legislation, protecting our children from being targeted for adoption into white homes. However, prior to that, it was a program of the Bureau of Indian Affairs to actually adopt our children out as continued assimilation programs extending from boarding schools. We currently have a study going on. If you go to our website, boardingschoolhealing.org, there will be a pop-up that asks you to participate in the study if you are American Indian, Alaskan Native. And this study is to look at those forms of child removal that have happened in the United States through boarding school, adoption, and foster care, looking at what the impacts are, looking at the connection, the intergenerational connection there, and also looking at how people are healing from that intergenerational trauma. So we also, in talking about the trauma, cite the 2014 White House report on Native youth, which said that there was an epidemic of suicide in our communities, that our Native youth had PTSD rates 3 times that of the general public, which is the same PTSD rate of veterans from the Iraqi war. So Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart coined the term historical trauma. The definition of historical trauma is the cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over one's lifetime and from generation to generation following loss of lives, land, and vital aspects of culture. Note that it says over one's lifetime. So it's not just what happened to my ancestors and my relatives, but it's that plus the accumulative effects of what I've experienced in my lifetime. So it's all of it. The DSM for counselors and psychologists doesn't have an identifier for our type of trauma. They just call it complex trauma because it's historical trauma, it's intergenerational trauma, it's post-traumatic stress trauma. It's all these traumas, and so they just call it complex trauma. And we also now know through science, confirming what Indigenous people call blood memory, that epigenetics is the term that describes how the trauma gets passed down from generation to generation through our DNA. So not only through experiences, but now through DNA. Dr. Rachel Yehuda studied children of the Holocaust, their children, and found that the descendants of Holocaust survivors were more likely to experience depression and anxiety. This is in line with what we know from the ACEs study, adverse childhood experiences, shows us that if a child experiences 4 or more of these 10 ACEs that were identified, that they are more likely to have negative health outcomes as an adult, including chemical dependency, mental health issues, but even obesity and heart disease and diabetes are linked to childhood trauma, because trauma in a child interrupts their brain development. And so we end up with this cycle of not only the trauma being passed down genetically, but being passed down through experience. And if somebody experienced trauma as a child, they grow up to have some of these potentially negative experiences and outcomes and disparities if they aren't fully engaged in healing, and then they pass that on to the next generation. And it is just a cycle that we know is possible to change and to disrupt. So how do we heal? Well, obviously, if we have intergenerational trauma that's passed down, we have intergenerational wisdom. We know that we have that blood memory also carries that strength and wisdom from our ancestors. And Dr. Braveheart also talks about how to heal that historical trauma with 4 easy steps. I always like to joke about that because it's not easy. But to simplify things, 1, we confront the historical trauma. Well, the United States has not confronted the truth about history in this country, both what it did to Indigenous peoples who lived here prior to settler colonialism, but what it did to, as far as slavery, bringing African people here to enslave them. And this country was built upon stolen land and slave labor. So whenever we're going to confront that is when we will begin the process of healing, because then after we confront it, acknowledge it, we have to understand it then. So that's a whole nother process, right? Of what does that mean? How has that impacted us? How has that permeated society? And how has that created institutional and structural racism? And then we need to work on, of course, releasing that pain, dealing with that, processing those emotions, and repairing those relationships before we can finally transcend the trauma or be healed or whole and move together forward into the future as human beings who do not do so much harm to each other. This is a piece of resource that we have on our website about, it's just a healing resource that we created. If anybody is feeling triggered by some of this conversation, I probably should have said this at the beginning, but these are some things that you can do to help care for yourself, both spiritually, mentally, emotionally, and physically. We do have a lot of programs that center on education, advocacy, and healing. One of them is Healing Voices, in which we are interviewing boarding school survivors and asking them to share their stories of hope and resiliency. We feel that that is very important, in addition to telling the truth about what has happened in this country, particularly around the policy to take Indigenous children and commit genocide through assimilation of those children. We often get asked about how many children went to boarding school and you know, how many of those children died. We get asked for a lot of statistics that we frankly just don't have. This is a graphic that was taken from that Healing Voices publication that I mentioned. And it's basically just, you know, pulling estimates from other people's research. And, you know, we get as far as 1925, which is right, you know, kind of in the middle of the boarding school era that lasted for nearly 100 years. So we are looking for the records to try and compile some of this data. In Canada, they had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. They were able to pull some of this data forward. So in 2016, we filed a FOIA request, a Freedom of Information Act request, asking the Bureau of Indian Affairs for information about how many boarding schools, how many children, from what nations were those children taken, and how many of those children died or went missing. What was the fate of those children? And they did not answer our FOIA, obviously. And then at one point, a journalist investigated and was told that the government said, we don't do research, right? Because these records are spread out all across the United States. And Sam and Stephen are going to talk a lot more about that. So we took our filing from a FOIA to, we escalated up to the United Nations, and we filed with all the partners and tribes that you see here on this press release. And we went to the United Nations in Geneva, Switzerland, and we filed these allegations against the United States. Through our own independent research and through researchers that we contracted with, we found children who went missing at boarding schools whose whereabouts to this day are still unknown. And that allowed us to submit this filing to the United Nations Working Group on Enforced Involuntary Disappearances. And they notified, that was last year, they notified the United States of our allegations. The United States had 60 days to respond, and they still haven't responded. So we are working with our partners to figure out next steps. And that is an open case right now, that we are still waiting for the United States to respond and tell us where these children who went missing, where they are. Because it's not only that we deserve to know, but we have the right to know. These are inherent human rights, not just Indigenous rights, but human rights that the U.S. has violated. So a little bit, I'm about to wrap it up and hand it over to my co-presenters. But a little bit about the difference between what happened in Canada and here in the United States. There's lots of similarities in terms of how these boarding schools were rolled out, how they were operated, the policies, the impacts, the experiences are all very, very similar. But the difference is in Canada, the people who went to these boarding schools were able to file a class action lawsuit. Here in the United States, the statute of limitations at the federal level is 40 years, and in some states it's even less. And therefore, we do not see an easy path forward in terms of some kind of lawsuit. That lawsuit was settled by the Canadian government, and those settlement funds were used to establish the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So as part of the commission, Canada court ordered the records of all these boarding schools to be brought forth to the commissioners to be analyzed. We in the United States are stuck doing our own independent research. So accessing these records is crucial to finding out the truth and painting the full picture of what boarding schools looked like, what happened to us in the United States at these boarding schools. In Canada, they found that they had 150 residential schools that were run by government and churches. Here in the United States, we have done research that has found 367 boarding schools that were run by the government and churches. So Canada 150, US 367. Canada found that over 100,000 children went to those boarding schools, and approximately 6,000 died or went missing. In the United States, we don't know how many children went to those 367 boarding schools, and we don't know how many died or went missing. So that is the end of my presentation. I am going to hand things over to Sam to talk more about that research that we are engaging in to find answers to truth and history.
Thank you, Christine. All right, and thank you for that a really thorough context for the work that that we need to do, that we are doing, and the historical context that really is the foundation for what we are here to do. And so the four main themes that I'm going to be discussing are historiographical. They are the challenges to research, and they are the decolonizing data and healing historical trauma. So one of the most important aspects of the work that needs to be done is we need to address the realities of what the histories that have been told in this country, the United States, and other settler colonial nation states like that, and those narratives that have been embedded within American exceptionalism and white supremacy. They hold a centuries-long history on these lands that ultimately emerged with the first settler colonists. The culture of dominant US American society has really proliferated from those origins of what Christine called, or she talked about a little bit with Manifest Destiny and the doctrine of discovery. And when we look at those foundations, it's not difficult to see how such a culture could persist and really proliferate those myths of superiority, of Euro-American superiority throughout history. And I think it's important that we can't forget that it was, if we look at this image right here, it was actually the Wampanoag people who saved the Pilgrim settlers from starvation and death during their first winter, which, if you look at this image, it's a scene that's notably absent from the one painted by J.L.G. Ferris in 1912. Yet these are the images that are extremely persistent in American textbooks. And it's those origin narratives and myths that are perpetuated through culture, through education, through politics, such as this, that has fueled and ultimately compelled the federal government and ultimately an entire culture, right, to desire to civilize, quote unquote, civilize an entire Indian nation. And using the words of John H. Oberle to save them from themselves, as he described here, the only alternative left is civilization or annihilation, absorption or extinction. And while I think it is, of course, appalling, it's not at all surprising then that when we look at our contemporary moment, that the only 4 states in the United States that have even a mention of Indian boarding schools in school standards from K-12, it's really a far cry that we are not addressing this in schools. Even most state standards in American public schools confine curriculum regarding Indigenous peoples to pre-1900, which we can argue a curricular and cultural move that invisibilizes and erases the existence of Indigenous peoples in the US. So there are certainly many challenges to research of this type, especially when we are engaged in not just talking with researchers who have done work, but looking for primary sources to be able to bring forth towards tribal nations to identify what are those research themes that to your community, to your nation, need to be addressed and need to be expounded upon. And so those challenges to even identifying those sources are plenty. And though there currently exist compelling historical volumes of documentation on the era, there's still a lot to learn. And we're still trying to determine how many schools there were in operation, how many students went missing, as Christine mentioned, the location of school cemeteries. And it's within our own research, as Christine mentioned. I want to show you this image because I think it's a really compelling image. 367 schools, 73 of which remain open today. Now, a large portion of those schools, and I think it could be argued most of them, have done a great deal to indigenize their curricula, have focused on culture, have focused on language, yet still have a large history of those classic historical models of the boarding school era. Our research efforts continue to develop, and over the past couple of years, we moved our research needle up to 367 from 357, and we don't anticipate that to slow down as our efforts continue to be developed. Central to our research efforts are foundational commitments to decolonizing data and Indigenous data sovereignty. It's not enough really to simply identify that the truth of this history is what is, the only focus of this type of research. We also have to call into question those traditional Western methods of research extraction, essentially data mining, that have commonly and historically been seen in disciplines such as anthropology, archaeology, social sciences, and really science in general. What decolonizing data does is it puts those data decisions in the hands of Indigenous peoples, acknowledges their inherent strengths, and puts them in control of what data is gathered, what is done with it, how it's interpreted, and what it will be used for. And it really ultimately gives Indigenous people the right to their own stories and their own information. And so examples of what those data look like, as you can see on the screen, data about land, water, geology, air, the environment, data about historical elements of individuals, administrative, health, social, commercial, traditional and cultural information. All of these fall under that purview. So Indigenous data sovereignty then is how we move the notion of Indigenous data into an element of rights, of ownership, and of what is done with information about Indigenous peoples and their history, ultimately the right of Indigenous peoples to govern the collection, ownership, and application of those data. And ultimately, this forms the central component of the research that we are doing, the research and archival practices that we are committing to. Those commitments are fundamentally to decolonizing data that support Indigenous data sovereignty and counters the threat of what Christine has called academic colonization. Academic colonization being the perpetuation of those paternalistic settler colonial mindsets and taking over Indigenous spaces by taking over Indigenous narratives through academic research that absents Indigenous voices, perspectives, and worldview, and in extreme cases seeks to profit. Now, this is another kind of colonization. It is a kind of a colonization of knowledge. It's a colonization of power as well, because as we know with education, with research, there is power always ascribed to that. This is this is from a forthcoming work that Christine McCleave and Dr. Rose Myron put together in a book chapter called Access to Truth, Healing, and Justice, Digitizing the Records of U.S. Indian Boarding Schools. That edited book volume is called Digital Mapping in Indigenous America, and is forthcoming later this year. So it's really exciting that that's going to be coming out. And this is a term that I anticipate will be continuing to be used as we continue to develop our work, and we hope to be able to highlight those methodological concerns, not just the data that is produced, not just those research interests that are being produced, but how that research is done. So how is data sovereignty mobilized through our work I think is extremely important. And I think the fundamental goal of that is to make those data on Indian boarding schools accessible to Native nations, but also to include and honor the wishes and the desires of those communities. And so as we collect sources of information from source repositories, we aim to continue to work with Native nations to determine how they want this data stored, represented, and accessed, because ultimately there will be items that aren't always in the best interest of the tribal nation for those to be publicly accessible, elements such as traditional knowledge, culturally sensitive items. And so working with communities will help to be able to identify those, as well as to put forth an ethical alternative to how research is produced. So I think it's important to share the framework, the overall foundational framework by which our research, archival information practices are being mobilized, and it's ultimately through that marriage of Indigenous sovereignty and decolonizing data. So tribal review, which is a goal of that combination, it's really the first element of where we need to be putting our efforts in relationship building. Since the central component of Indigenous data sovereignty is the right of tribal nations to control the collection, ownership, and that right, it's imperative that research activities be approved through their own review process, be it tribal IRB, a research review board, tribal council resolution, and these things can be very different from tribal nation to tribal nation. And so those relationships are very important to be able to understand what are the processes that are desired of the community. This is applicable for oral histories, ethnographic interview processes, as well as gathering community members together to share stories or contribute to archival metadata creation and curation. And with permission of individual tribal nations, NABS wishes to center the voices of communities whose data are being gathered, interpreted, and presented. Primarily, this can be achieved by facilitating tribal sharing and listening sessions, offering communities the opportunity to review and provide feedback prior to any general release. These sessions are extremely helpful for determining those data or documents that are considered culturally sensitive, and if traditional knowledge is to be flagged for access restriction or to be prevented from publishing altogether. Now, lastly, the element that all of this allows us to really engage in is this notion of healing. And it's a big one, as Christine talked about. And she brought up the name of Dr. Braveheart earlier about defining historical trauma. But I really appreciate Dr. Braveheart's notion of transcending historical trauma. And in order to heal from historical trauma, it's not enough just to invite a community to heal or to heal themselves or to seek healing. And that first step, as we can see right here, is confronting the historical trauma. But we can't confront that historical trauma if we don't know what it is. And so the work that we are doing, we feel very strongly, is forming the foundation, is underlining the work that we know is to follow, and the work that has been seen within our gatherings, within working with communities and developing healing models, community-led healing models, and opportunities for people to come share their stories, of course with counselors and healers present, but to help release that pain in order to transcend the trauma. And I think a salient point to return to Christine's initial inclusion of this pathway toward healing, that if we carry intergenerational trauma, then we also carry intergenerational wisdom. That also is in our genes and in our DNA. It's that blood memory as well, and it gives us plenty of a strong ancestral foundation to be able to transcend that. But of course, it's a lot of work, and we are humbled and charged by that mission, by that vision, to be able to work in that direction. So Stephen is going to share a little bit about the digital archives and the archival practices that that we are working on so expeditiously. So Stephen, the floor is yours.
All right, great. Thank you very much, Samuel. So a lot of the words that get thrown around to describe our work is Herculean and the sheer magnitude. So it's very monumental work. There's a lot to be done. And I'm very lucky to be able to work with Dr. Torres. A lot of our work actually has a lot of overlap with one another. Samuel had shared this image with you earlier in his section, and so this is something that we typically point towards to illustrate the fact of the disparate nature of the records themselves in terms of where they're located geographically. So, so we know just from looking at this map that there are built-in limitations for source communities' ability to consult with these types of primary source materials. So one example, one potential project that we're actively having discussions about involves communities from the Pacific Northwest, and those boarding school records that pertain to them are located all the way in Missouri, which is roughly 1,800 miles away. So again, the extent to which these records are disconnected from the people they relate to is pretty stark. A way to cope with that is, of course, to digitize them. And so this is where the body of my work comes into play. So this is, of course, one of the primary motivators for NABS wanting to build outward this idea of a centralized digital archive, which I think those conversations began about 2 years ago or so. But 2 years later, to date, the digital archive is now called the National Indian Boarding School Digital Archive, so NIBSDA for short. So I'll be referring to it as NIBSDA. Of course, questions of access aren't the only motivators. Certainly the primary purpose is to centralize in order to produce research findings about this boarding school era that can, of course, provide further insight to the historiography that's ubiquitously and under-examined. A big piece of that research is conducted. A big piece of that research can be accountable, can hold those institutions accountable for those historic infractions to tribal communities.
Sorry to interrupt, Stephen. Can we all mute our microphones? Thanks. Well, so we can hear Stephen. Thanks.
Thank you. So we have actually made some headway with regards to what we do know about these records, namely where they exist in the United States. This time last year, NABS has identified about 375 boarding schools, institutions, and accounted for roughly 23% of those boarding school institutions' records. So to date, we're currently looking at 367. And we're actually dealing with about 38% of those records. We know where those locations are. So continued survey activities need to be conducted so we have a better grasp of not only where these records are, but what these records indeed consist of. So again, that figure is 38%, and it has increased as we utilize our survey strategies and tactics with these institutions who do have these records. So it would be actually, this is one important thing to note. So it would be also a little misleading to interpret this 38 figure as fully representative of the total body of records pertaining to boarding schools, simply because we don't know what the full scope of that material located at these repositories is. So in addition to that, those known repositories may only have a cross-section of what was originally created. So, which is all the more important for us to establish and lay this network consisting of varied communities of practice who can contribute to and assist in and advocate for the retrieval and reclamation of boarding school material. So another thing to note down there in the lower right corner is the institutional types, where we're actually finding these boarding school records and archival materials. I'll just focus on the first two. So a large segment of where these locations are going to be in the federal repositories like NARA, which this image visualizes, and of course church repositories, which is at 28.5%. So I've already touched on the scattered nature of the records. One of the other things is the fact that the NIBSDA project also represents a larger shift in the management and collection of records. So there's a lot of implications that can come about that. So we have to think about nuanced issues of what Dr. Torres already described, and data sovereignty, and how tribal communities are represented. And we also need to think about other things like how those partnerships between those source institutions are going to be actively cultivated, and how they're going to manifest, agreements to feature these records within our NIBSDA platform. So thankfully, there are discussions to do also in professional circles, like in the archives world. There's what's called the Protocols of Native American Archival Material, which are designed to be best practices on how usually non-tribal institutions who have native collections can be proactive in the responsible and ethical stewardship of those collections. So that's actually something that's pretty foundational to what we're trying to do, and we're sort of trying to work towards capitalizing off of this these conditions that are currently going on within the archives discipline. So think about in terms of other projects down there at the bottom, the third bullet there. We want to coalesce other projects that are doing similar things, like our friends over at Dickinson College, our friends over at the Genoa Project, University of Nebraska, and the Stewart Museum in Sherman, Indian Museum, who you'll actually hear from next, part 2 and part 3 of this webinar series. We want to take what we're all doing collectively and take it to that national level scope, which would of course include the aggregation and sort of the centralization of all of these boarding school materials, but also all of the boarding school materials found in other digital projects. So in order to do that, we're actually utilizing the University of Minnesota's Liberal Arts Technology and Innovative Services programs system called Elevator. So this is a digital asset management system that would make it very feasible for us to be able to curate, upload, preserve, and ultimately present and make accessible all these records together in sort of one system. So we're actually strategically, we're shooting for a launch of this system in July of 2022. So that's something to put on your calendars. Yeah, we'll definitely keep everybody abreast to any new developments going on. So for all intents and purposes, I wanted to communicate to you that there's actually collection types. So you'll notice that the first one there relates to boarding school records proper. So boarding school records proper typically relate to material that's created institutionally by those boarding school institutions themselves, and maintained and ultimately transferred to custodians such as NARA, National Archives Records Administration. So again, for all intents and purposes, each of these bullets here in this slide are records, and that they are all artifacts in a fixed format, which inform our understanding of the past. So, however, in the context of this slide, records relate to fixed formats created and maintained by the boarding school institutions themselves, which I just described with the records. So the main impetus and driver of these boarding school movement is to illuminate that history in the records. So this is the primary motivator for us in terms of what I do at NABS. So of course, speaking to the talking points that Christine and Dr. Torres brought forth to you about context, we're really only limited currently to just the records, which were of course written from a certain point of view. And so, as is the case with all historical analysis and research, we need to be able to be cognizant of the fact that the primary source documentation is only one side of this very multifaceted, multi-dimensional reality that absolutely needs to be compressed or distilled into an interpretive framework that Dr. Torres described that will lend itself well to this very complicated history. So in order for us to navigate and sift through this particular one-sided nature of what the records are embedding in terms of the information, we need to first off collect or centralize these records, and then also have those source institutions or source communities, those tribal communities, provide further context to the interpretation of them. So we know that records inform one another, which is why we need to diversify our understanding of this era with a variety of record types or collection types. NIBSDA will have a lot of different types of records. So you'll see things like student papers and student case files, which tend to be the most popularly used type of material. These typically contain report cards, progress reports, medical profiles, registration paperwork, familial correspondence, and student sort of assignments and final papers and things like that. So looking at that type of material is pretty fascinating, and it really gives us a sense of the paternalistic sentiments of the boarding school policy that sort of bleed into what the students were being taught. So this one talks about citizenship in the lower left corner. You also see other things like financial records, which to the clever person can be very telling and be very insightful into the structure and the way that these institutions were operated. So it can tell us, the extent to which funds were being funneled into the institution, and from it can tell us sort of who the stakeholders were and the industry of the boarding school era, and how much investment, if any, was being directed or redistributed to other institutions to perpetuate itself. So other types of material are curricula and lesson plans, administrative correspondence. So this is actually particularly pretty interesting, is that there are papers that could tell us the network that these schools maintained and how much of a broad reach their spheres of influence were. And a lot of the times institutions received students from day schools or even public schools, sometimes that were in close proximity of these institutions where they received transferred students from other institutions. Schools typically also tracked students post-graduation and reported on their contributions to their respective communities based on the education that they received. So that this is kind of another selling point for, or really a justification point to measure the performance of that boarding school institution. So I think I'm going to try to blow through these just a little bit more effectively because I want to get around to the demo. But the values, of course, are going to be things that that provide guidance to this trajectory of research and that feedback loop of how research is conducted and how we prioritize and strategize the continued collection as we move forward of these records. So of course we want to adhere to responsible stewardship. So that was already depicted in terms of what that model can look like. There's the element of trust. So we want to be able to cultivate transparency and establish meaningful relationships with all partners. So that would be source institutions, source repositories, source communities, which would be the tribal communities themselves, to make sure that we're as forthright with our intentions as possible. Advocacy, the third bullet point there. Healing is, of course, our primary motivator. Preservation. We want to make sure that this particular niche within the historical record is preserved so that we can continue to develop and bolster that historiography associated with these records particularly. We want to be, of course, of service to those Native communities in supporting their own tribal healing initiatives wherever possible. And with the records, we can also, statement of fact, we can produce truth in that history. And of course, there's justice in that truth. So of course, we need to also be able to say that we're fulfilling the objectives of the scope of NIBSDA. So we want to preserve the future. We want to preserve these records for future insights. We want to contribute to the development and verification of the authoritative list of the 365 current known boarding schools. And as we delve further into the records, we're finding more and more schools that we need to audit. Essentially, we need to confirm whether or not they were actual schools. So that's something that is ongoing. We need to continue to identify and locate U.S. Indian boarding school records. That's basically what I just got done describing throughout the entirety of this particular section. We need to centralize those historical records and documents. We need to be able to produce meaningful relationships. We need to sort of involve this notion of a holistic endeavor of cultivating a community of practice and an ethic of collecting within tribal communities, so that we can produce instances where maybe they have their own tribal archives where they're interested in receiving what we are digitizing. So that's kind of an instance where we're preserving simultaneously by creating, by adhering to this principle of lots of copies keep stuff safe. So the last is going to be records retention and disposition schedule. So that's kind of more of a back-end operational value of what we need to do for NIBSDA, but that's really just to track the functioning and management of the policies and procedures that are being produced as we progress through the development of NIBSDA. So we also need to, in order to meet those objectives, we need to be very systematized about everything, because what we're essentially dealing with is data. So we need to do this in an intelligible, logical, sequential order. Sometimes it works out this way, but generally speaking, this chart represents what this process can look like as an ideal, or what it should look like as a normative statement. This is a pretty nice generalized representation of sort of our workflow. So assuming everything transpires in a linear fashion, we would presumably start with research leads, which of course is hoping to answer the question, where are the records? These can be leads from survivors, researchers, archivists, which highlights the fact that this is a collective effort, of course. This would then lead to interfacing with source institutions or those source repositories about the collections we've identified. We then confirm these are collections that fall within our scope of work. Then, assuming they indeed are, or they do, we would enter into discussions about how we can work out provisions to essentially share these collections. Then we move forward. We're kind of moving in moving to the right here. We digitize what we identified, then process it, catalog it, describe it, and then ultimately publish it to the NIBSDA Elevator Instance platform. So you'll notice there are two essential ingredients to this workflow that Dr. Torres had already alluded to, which were the tribal contributions. So we want to make every opportunity to have respective tribes tell us what matters to them. So that translates to things like what should we prioritize when we're scanning? What shouldn't we digitize for a variety of reasons? And pointers about how we can maximize those descriptions once we get around to cataloging in the digital asset management system. So the other thing that we take very seriously is we build into the workflow a tribal review process where designated officials can provide feedback and guide us before publication of these materials takes effect. So I just want to say that we relish the opportunity to work with tribal TIPOs, council people, cultural preservation community folks, and whatever those tribal structures may look like. We definitely appreciate and take into account what we're learning from those sessions when we're interfacing with those parties. So a large piece of this workflow also involves the digitization and description. So I'll actually get into that in terms of what it looks like once we get into the demo. I'm going to go to the next slide. Okay, this is kind of like the educational slide. Metadata. For those who aren't in the archives field or library field, metadata is essentially data about the records. So that can typically translate into the titles or the dates or the formats or the people that are referenced within the documents themselves. Those are elemental fields that we want to, as a baseline, capture as we're cataloging this information. And so that's kind of a method to make sure that not only are we digitizing things, but we're also making it be readily retrievable. Because the trick is you don't want to just hoard stuff. You want to be able to organize it so that you can retrieve it. So this is kind of an interesting number here. So I mentioned our friends over at Carlisle and our friends over at the Sherman Indian Museum, or not Carlisle, the Dickinson College project with Carlisle. So the Carlisle Indian School Digital Resource Center has about 17,000 records uploaded to their site, with the Sherman Indian Museum having about 14,000. So that's an average split between the two, 15.5 thousand records. So if we extrapolate that number to the 367 known schools, give or take, that's in the millions. So we have 5,600,000 records that we were anticipating essentially to be uploaded to the NIBSDA platform. So it's a pretty powerful system that we're working with here. So another thing is templates, school record templates and name authority templates are sort of the backbone for how this information and data is being organized. So we have boarding school record entries, personal name record entries, and I'll show you this once we get around to the demo too. So just another visual in terms of how we're extracting data that's embedded in these records to produce catalog records. So we see, that this was pulled from the Carson Indian School, which is essentially the Stewart Indian School. So this is something that we need to be cognizant of when we're creating our descriptions, essentially. Okay, so I'm actually just going to jump into the demo. Give me 1 second while I transfer over. Okay, so this is NIBSDA. So I mentioned we're going to be launching this in 2022. So you're getting very much an advanced demo or preview of what this system is going to look like. So what this system is going to look like on the homepage is just what you're seeing now. It's going to be very much, well, at least right now, it's pretty simple. Cosmetically, it might have more information about the site, how things can be used. But I want to take you to a proof of concept in terms of what one of these boarding school record entries is going to look like. We have a record titled Hoopa Valley Students Unaccounted For, 1938 through 1939. This was captured from the NARA repository, I believe in San Bruno. So this is really going to depict the boarding school document template that we're working with. And so the baseline elements that we're utilizing are going to be title, date, description, format, keyword, people, school, collection, location, source repository. The interesting thing with Elevator is that we're able to overlay templates on top of templates on top of templates, and so on and so forth, so we can really create a powerful, robust relationship between these different records. And so this is the boarding school template record. One thing I want to point out is that as we are digitizing, we're actively capturing OCR, optical character recognition, information from the records themselves. So everything that you see in the TypeScript is being transcribed, and it will actually be, once we get around to the upload steps within our workflow, all of this information will be indexed into Elevator. So we're actually able to search for certain words. If we're looking for specific students within the document, it'll take you to that word if it's in there, in addition to it being indexed site-wide. So you can actually utilize this Google style search tool here at the top left corner and search for that same student, and that should pull up a number of search results or hits within the system. So again, it's pretty powerful. I want to bring you to this notion of boarding school name authority records. So you'll see that Hoopa Valley Boarding School is attached to this record itself. We can actually, with the system, it can create a cascading menu to sort of show you more information about that school, or we can go directly to that record entry itself on a separate page. So I'll go to that real quick. And so it'll pull up information about the school in terms of, when it was in operation, the location of the school, who the operator was. If there was an agency associated with the school, that would also be indicated, in addition to a historical note that is generated and drafted by, compiling research from peer-reviewed sources to produce this historical note. Variant names, we often find that certain schools often have colloquialisms or shorthand common names associated with them. So this is the point of having a boarding school name authority record, is to be able to point to one source for that school. So this kind of takes into consideration and takes into account those different variant names. Sources kind of relates to historical note. With Elevator, we're actually able to browse by state, as long as that's something that we're wanting to do. So we can actually browse and filter out, different boarding schools by the state in which they were located. So currently, there's only 2 boarding schools that are created in the system right now that relate to California. I'll just show you what that looks like. I'm sorry, I'm thinking of a different state. There's actually more schools associated with California that have been uploaded. So this is pretty powerful indeed to enhance how users are going to be interacting with this interface, how they're going to be using the platform. I'm actually going to go to St. Anthony's real quick. So of course, this is a California-centric webinar. So it's some of you folks who are viewing right now might know exactly where these locations are. So with the boarding school record, the thing with St. Anthony's is it had relocated at some point in time to the outskirts of San Diego. The original location was in Old Town. So we can actually go to a geo-coded representation. It can be a topo map, just like with this, or it could be a satellite sort of depiction of where these boarding schools were located. The other one in the outskirts going to be in Grantsville. So we can actually pinpoint where these schools are located now, or historically where they're located. And so that's also the trick with some of the continued research that is ongoing. So I kind of wanted to maybe end there. I see that we might be going over, I might be going over a little bit So I want to give it back to Dr. Torres.
Great, thank you, Stephen. So now we are going to be doing a bit of a Q&A, and we have some good questions that are coming in. Oh, Christine, unmute you.
Yeah, so that was amazing. So glad that we got to see that demo. Apologies that we are running a little bit behind on our schedule. Hopefully everybody who's still with us can stay for the Q&A. Sam is going to moderate that for us. All right, Sam, hit us with those questions.
Great. So we have quite a few questions regarding the availability of the information that is in this slideshow, this presentation, and the recording. And so, Christine, our CEO, I'll let you respond to the questions. Will this PowerPoint be available, and will the recording be available later on?
Absolutely. We are recording, and we don't have an exact plan laid out. I'll have to confer with my director of communications, but yes, we will make these recordings available. And so those will be available eventually on our YouTube. And we did a webinar series last year. So if you go to our YouTube channel, you can view those webinars there as well. Was that the only part of the question? Was the specifics about this webinar series?
As well as the presentation slides.
Oh, okay. So the recording, if you go and look at last year's webinar series that's out on YouTube, you'll be able to see both the presenter speaking and the slides.
Great. Here's another question that might not be at the foundation of our research, but I think is an interesting question nonetheless. A attendant asking, why are they called residential schools in Canada and boarding schools in the US?
Why are they called Aboriginal people in Canada and Indians in the US? I don't know. I think it's just nomenclature that developed, and they basically mean the same thing. You know, the students reside at the residential schools at least 9 months out of the year, which is the difference between a residential school or a boarding school and a day school, which is the students go there during the day and then they go home in the evening. So that is one of the things that we have as the basis of some of the research that we're doing in defining what is a boarding school. It means that the children have to live there 9 months out of the year. And as we know, there are some other similar schools that were targeting assimilation of Indigenous children, but they were day schools. So we don't include those.
Yeah, I think some of that nomenclature is really just cultural, as you mentioned. You know, different settlers came in from different places and proliferated from there. An interesting question. Here's another one. I research St. Boniface Indian Industrial School, Catholic mission school formerly located in Banning. One of the barriers I ran into with trying to obtain records from the Catholic Church, they stated, 1, I had to pay for the records. 2, I would have to show proof of descendancy from the students whose records I would be requesting. And I think this is a really good question overall, Christine, to respond to about some of the obstacles that private institutions like the Catholic Church and other Christian denominations have presented because of these types of inquiries. So what to be done about these types of obstacles?
I'm really sorry to hear that you encountered that, and but I'm also not surprised, as we have also encountered some of that type of gatekeeping. And so we are advocating for these records to be made public. We are advocating under the premise that these are our rights to have access to this information, that in these cases, in many cases, these schools were propagating genocide, and therefore, as a human rights violation, we have a right to access that that data and those records. So we have a right to the truth about what happened to these children. So specifically, you know, if you're a relative of somebody who attended one of these schools, but then of course that puts the burden of proof on the researcher or the descendant or relative to, you know, come up with proof. But really that's the purpose of behind what we're doing here in trying to get all of these records on this public platform so that they are accessible to not only descendants and relatives, but to researchers and the general public. So it is unfortunate that we are experiencing some of that pushback. We will continue to advocate for the truth.
Good, well stated. Here's another question about church institutions. With 28.5% of records being held in church institutions, do we know how that breaks down by denominations? And right off the top, you know, I think it's important to share that we're still determining what these values are. And I think those numbers and how it breaks down are going to continue to show us as we continue to devote more time and energy and resources toward that. But Stephen, did you want to respond a little bit to how, you know, we are tracking those institutions that do have those those breakdowns and the denominations that we're keeping track of?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the short answer is we're not really getting as granular into those details specifically, because these are kind of strategic questions that we're trying to decipher in terms of how we're going to start to approach the overall category of tribal records held at or boarding school records held at church institutions or church repositories. So that's really it's not broken down to different denominations, unfortunately, at this point, because we simply don't have, you know, that information. In addition to, you know, that's maybe something that, you know, we need to have further discussions about.
And to this point, we are also still determining those institutions that are what their operators are and what denomination that those institutions are, and that's a feat in and of itself, let alone where those collections are being held. And so, as you can tell, there's a lot to be researched, there's a lot to be studied, but it's all part of you know, working to reveal that truth in this historical era. Another really good question. What is the time frame of the records you seek? Is it 1902 to whatever, 1960? And yeah, wondering about that. And Christine has done a lot of work defining what that historical assimilation model of boarding school parameters might be. And for now, we've identified that the time frame that we're looking for is 1870 to 1970, and there are even still schools that were around until, you know, many schools that were around in 1980 after, you know, prior to their closures by the Reagan administration. Yeah, Christine, can you share with us a little bit about the rationale for what that starting point is on 1870?
Well, we know that's when the first federal off-reservation boarding school started in Carlisle in 1879. And then although we include schools up to 1970 as historical assimilative boarding schools, we are not able to access the records past 1945 due to privacy laws. So in terms of what we're looking to digitize and what we're able to get access to, it's basically, you know, from the first boarding school, federally funded boarding school in 1879 up to 1945, but you know, with each passing year, that threshold will move forward as well. And I also want to circle back to that question about the churches, in that we have also been working with some different denominations who are, and each denomination is different. Some are more responsive, and some are much more proactive and willing to engage with us in terms of, you know, making a commitment to truth and history, and making a commitment commitment to what some would call truth and reconciliation, or tagging it on to the work that they've done around repudiating the doctrine of discovery and having it be a follow-up action. Okay, so several denominations have repudiated the doctrine. What does that mean? What are they doing now? How are they working on actively repairing their relationships with Indigenous peoples and pulling out their boarding school records and sharing those and making those public is one of those actions that they can take that would be considered, in Christian terms, an act of atonement or repentance and reconciliation. And so we are engaging in those types of conversations. Different denominations are at different points along the spectrum in terms of both willingness and ability to help us gather those records and digitize them.
Great. Here's a good logistical question, and I think this will be helpful for those that are tuning in to understand a little bit of our work. Who is the best person to contact if we are interested in data sharing and collaboration?
Well, we have, I guess you could contact any of us, and we work as a team. So eventually all of us will be in on the conversation, but for convenience and ease of communication, you can email us at info@nabshc.org. So maybe I'll just go ahead and send that out in the chat to everybody. Let's see. Oh, I don't have the option. Perhaps you do, Sam, as the organizer.
Send that. Yeah, I'll definitely send that out. This one is more of a comment, but I think speaks to one of the goals of our research and moving towards healing. Thank you so much for doing this work. We found my grandfather's records in the Chicago branch of the National Archives. I know we are lucky to have it and to somewhat know what he endured as a child. And being able to hear comments like that, and though we can't entertain in-person gatherings right now, when we hear that in person, when we're able to share that, it means a great deal. So thank you for sharing that reflection with us. And of course, we hope to be able to engage you all a little bit more personally in the years to come once we're able to gather more safely. Here's another question. CEO, I'm a scholar doing related work and have captured specific records from record group 75 on BIA mental health, on a BIA mental health program, which assessed ultimately sometimes sent youth to boarding schools. Would your team be interested in connecting and discussing possible alignments and collaborations? We recognize that this work takes relationship building and connections like that. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Oftentimes the workload is bigger than the time and the capacity, the resources that we all have, but to be able to have collaborative partnerships to work towards that same direction is really powerful. So again, we'll put our email address in the chat in just a moment. All right, I think we have time for maybe a question or two. What are your current processes for gathering leads for locations of records? Have you done any surveys or questions on regional archival listservs or contacted regional archival societies to poll their members?
So I'll let Sam and Stephen answer this, but I just want to say, strategically, big picture, we are going after the low-hanging fruit. Obviously, we're trying to locate records for 367 schools. And like Stephen said, that's monumental, that's mammoth. And so, yeah, we are still looking for the other records, but I'll let the guys tell you what those tactics are.
Yeah, so that's a good comment. That's something that we're very cognizant of, that we need to tap into regional societies like different associations that are region specific. So one of the things that I was wanting to employ in terms of my tactics and looking at boarding school records in the state of California was knowing that there is indeed a consortium of catalog information with the Calisphere and the Online Archive of California. So those are things that are invaluable to us in our tasks to locate material like this. And so California is pretty special in the fact that they do have an OAC tool like that. Other states don't. So that's kind of something that we're very much aware of. And yeah, just to echo Christine's comments about the low-hanging fruit. The low-hanging fruit is going to relate to those federal records. So we definitely have partnerships already established, conversations already established with NARA to engage what we're seeing. But the survey that I mentioned before is definitely ongoing, and you know we're just kind of or a staff of 4 currently. So if again, I want to reiterate, if you know of any records, let us know. We have very much we're highly invested in knowing where these records are. Sam, do you have anything to say about that?
That is a good summary of that, Stephen. Let's move on to a couple other questions. There are many questions coming in here. So, all right. Here's one, outside of the digital archives about more research and review, do you interview survivors for your research? If so, how is it recorded?
Yeah, that's a good question, and none of these are, you know, simple and straightforward. Of course, they're all complex and nuanced. So in terms of interviewing survivors, yes, we have done some interviews for the Healing Voices digital story collection. That under, you know, the Healing Voices movement was meant more to be curated and public facing, not necessarily what we would consider in academic terms an oral history, or even in legal terms a testimony, but more, like I said, curated, edited, and inspirational. In terms of, you know, telling people, acknowledging that some trauma happened at boarding school, but then really telling people about their healing journey. So that is the extent that we have done. We consider collecting testimony and oral history, you know, using those terms and within those frameworks, we take that very seriously. And so we have not yet embarked upon that for several reasons. One, it needs to be undertaken with great care, and the other is just capacity. You know, as of a year ago, I was a staff of 2 back down to a staff of 1, and now we're a staff of 4. So, you know, we are working towards that eventually, and it is part of the larger picture about this truth in history. It absolutely has to be balanced out between the federal and the church records and our perspective, our stories. However, we want to make sure that we're not taking advantage of people. We want to make sure that we're not triggering people's trauma. We know from what happened in Canada with the TRC there and the regional hearings that they did, where they literally had, you know, hundreds of people come in and share their testimonies, that that was a large undertaking that required a lot of resources, a lot of time, a lot of energy, both emotional, mental, and spiritual. That, you know, people could give their testimony in a large auditorium at a microphone in front of the commissioners and with an audience if they wanted that, or they could go in private and just do one-on-one, or they could submit it in writing. So to give people the options, to give people the support, and then to, you know, to do it well. We're not there yet, but we want to be. We really want to be as soon as we can.
I really like this question that I'm about to read, because I think it demonstrates well, its answer demonstrates the nuance and the power of NIBSDA, the ability to be able to parse out certain data. So if you have Navajo boarding school data, are you treating them as a collective and hopefully not separating them by their location in Arizona, Utah, and New Mexico, and formally in really early years to include Colorado? I'm asking because we need to work with specific Dene practitioners and also health professionals to help with healing intervention and involvement. I think this is a really good question for Stephen to go into and help us understand what NIBSDA can do with respect to looking for information, specific information, such as the inquiry here.
Yeah, I'm reading over that question. And my initial response to that, which is it's a very good question, is we haven't got around to working at all with Navajo Nation boarding school records thus far. Sort of generally or generically speaking, how we approach capturing metadata fields is that those are all baseline data sets that are going to be uniformly captured dependent on what the records tell us. So they're all going to be specific to the records themselves. I don't know if that answered your question, but let's see. But we definitely, just kind of harkening back to tribal review and sort of those processes and the data sovereignty initiatives and strategies, we always opt for interfacing with tribal representatives or any designated personnel to sort of make those decisions for us. So hopefully that answered your question.
Great, here's another one. A project at the University of Nebraska was mentioned. I'm in Nebraska and was wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about what the university is doing or where to learn more.
Yeah, I thought I saw Stephen typing. I was like, oh, he's going to pull it up. So it's the University of Nebraska is digitizing the records from the Genoa Indian School. And we can send out a link to that. They have a website page. They haven't launched the digital archive yet. So there is nothing published yet, but they do have a homepage that talks about the project, and it is underway.
No, yeah, I was pulling up the full name of the project because I usually just call it the Genoa project, but it's the Genoa Indian School Digital Reconciliation Project. So that's helmed by co-directors Margaret Jacobs and Liz Lorraine. Very good friends of ours.
Yes. Another a really good comment here, and we're happy to see it. I'm with Presidio Heritage Trust. We're gathering records. It is slow because of COVID. We do have the records of St. Anthony's at Old Town San Diego and are happy to share as we get them. And of course, anytime we are interacting with with an audience, with our friends, with our collaborators, we're grateful to continue to do this work together. Again, there's only 4 of us right now, and as we build our staff, we'll be able to do more with those. But we are, of course, grateful and excited to be able to incorporate records of all types into NIBSDA. So thank you for that, and any of you else out there that have similar feelings and intentions, please feel free to reach out to us. This is a long-term goal of ours, is to be able to populate NIBSDA, and we know it's going to take a very long time. And so we're patient, humbled by that task. We're excited to continue to move forward with it.
And also, we're not alone. We're 4 full-time staff who, and by full-time staff, I mean, like, we are dedicated to this, but we also have a board of directors who volunteer their time and resources, and we have a coalition of over 160 members who are individuals and organizations, native and non-native, and researchers who either volunteer or contract with us, students who reach out to us. I mean, we keep saying, like, oh, we're only 4 people because, yeah, we've got a lot on our plate, but we are not alone. We know that we have a lot of support out there. So we thank you for being willing to join us and for thinking about joining the coalition or sharing your resources and information, collaborating with us on research and all of that.
Great. Here's one that I think potentially each one of us could respond to, but I really like, the level of granularity with some of these things. How long does the tribal review process usually take for NIBSDA? And that question is a complicated question, right? Because when we're interfacing with a tribal nation, they are their own sovereign nation, and their processes are ones that we adhere to. And so that timeline looks different for everyone. But we also want to make it very clear that they're involved from the beginning to publishing, and we are, as we're currently seeing with one of our active projects with the Upper Sioux community, where we, prior to even approaching this grant process for digitizing records of Indian school records for their community, we had these conversations together. We planned this together, and ultimately got to a point where in our relationship, we're able to start talking about what types of materials are to be located, to be found, and how they are to be presented. So it looks very different from nation to nation, and as an organization that's committed to data decolonization and Indigenous data sovereignty, we're not going to put a quantified time stamp on that, but we are pretty confident that it takes that we can generalize that it will often take years in order to from start to finish.
And COVID has changed things as well, so there is no one size fits all.
Yeah, it takes as long as it needs to take, because the work is very much interinstitutional. So there's a lot of given the fact that, Christine, you brought up COVID, there's a lot of limitations that other institutions who are our partners, they're dealing with right now, and same with us. Even we're limited in some fashion. So I wanted to bring our attention to one of these other questions about how tribal community members can be involved. And so one of the things too is that we and soliciting sort of this partnership between us and tribal communities, particularly tribal governments. Sometimes that can take a while to really initiate and start up those conversations between those entities. So if you're a community member, just if you know people sort of in the upper echelons of the government, just tell them that you saw this webinar, and try to transmit that information about NABS as much as you can.
And once we have it published, you can even send them the link and they can watch it themselves. Well, I want to be respectful of people's time. Thank you for everyone who has stayed with us past the scheduled time. If you have to go, feel free, and just reach back out to us. If you've registered for this one, please join us for part 2 and part 3. But why don't we just take one last question, Sam? So feel free to pick and choose what you think is a good one to end with.
All right, so I think this would be a good summary right here. A map of, it's more of I guess an inquiry, right? A map of the over 300 schools across the country would be helpful, and indeed it is. And you can find that on our website in our educational resources. We are really excited to have recently updated it just a couple months ago. And as of, just this past month, it is already, we're finding new information and new research with every workday that we have. And so those numbers, like we mentioned earlier, we anticipate them to grow and to morph as we learn more information about that. But you can find those resources on our website, boardingschoolhealing.org. Look for resources, and the map is posted on our website there.
Yes, so that's a PDF of the centerfold, and we call it a map, but we've really only superimposed a map of the United States behind a list that is organized by state. However, we are working on a digital map project, similar to what they developed in Canada after the TRC. If you go to what is now, after the commission ended, they transitioned it to the Center for Truth and Reconciliation. If you go to the Center for Truth and Reconciliation's website and scroll down on the bottom of their homepage, there's an interactive map that, similar to what Stephen showed us earlier when he demoed our NIBSDA platform, you would be able to actually see where the boarding school was located. And so both the digital archive and the digital map will work interactively with each other. But the idea is to be able to actually give you a website or a web page where you can go and you will see where the boarding school was on the map. When you click on it, you'll get a summary of information that, you know, we're in the process of trying to collect little, you know, short bios, if you will, on each of the school, you know, what its years of operation were, who ran it, was it federally or church run, and if it was church run, what denomination, and some minimal information if there are any boarding school buildings still standing from that boarding school, or if it has, for example, in the case of the Albuquerque Indian School, turned into the All Pueblo Cultural Center, or in the case of Carlisle, if it is now, if it remains an Army barracks and is now the Army War College and has a cemetery there, you know, so some basic general information. But back to the list that we have, like I said, you can get the PDF, which is just the list. But that is actually the centerfold of our Healing Voices publication. And volume 1 is the primer on U.S. Indian boarding school history. And if you become a member of the coalition, which is free for individuals, and a nominal fee if you are an organization or a tribe, but free for individuals, if you become a member of the coalition, we will send you a free copy of that publication. That's my last plug for membership.
Great.
Join
yes.
us.
As always, please join us. Follow our follow us online, our social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and sign up for a newsletter as well. We are very happy that you joined us today, especially that we went a little bit over time. So thank you for offering us your extra time. And we look forward to seeing you next week, where we will host a panel to talk a little bit more about the records in California. So thank you again from all of us at NABS. We wish you good health, and we'll see you next time.
Gigawabaman, Bamapi.
Thank you.